Hello, my name is Professor Stephen Hoskins from the Centre for Fine Print Research at the University of the West of England in Bristol. I'm going to talk to you today about European printing museums and my personal top 10. For many years, I was a member of the Association of European Printing Museums and sat on its council. And from 2010 to 2012, I was chair of the association, which meant over the years I've travelled to most of Europe's, or to many of Europe's, 70 or so printing museums. Before I talk about my top 10, I thought I'd talk a little bit about, sadly, some of those that are no longer in existence, have moved, or are in storage. First of all, the Imprimerie Nationale in Paris. This huge, beautiful building was sold in 2007 by the French government, and the Imprimerie, which was the National Printing Works, was actually moved out to the outskirts of Paris. But in the middle of the building was a printing museum, and it covered every type of printing, including collotype and photogravure, lithography, and still hand-engraved type matrices. The sad thing is when I visited in 2007, as it was about to be closed down, as we're about to leave the building, all of the workers started singing us traditional French printing songs. The printing museum in Cockermouth was run by somebody called David Wigworth, who sadly died in 2008. And this little museum of iron printing presses has now, in fact, closed down, and the building's been repurposed for something else. The Danish Media Museum, which was one of the first museums to actually present its collection from printing history right through to modern computer media and modern media and television, was run by somebody called Irving Nielsen, and was a beautiful museum in Odense up in the north of Denmark. Sadly, at the moment, it's closed and it's looking for a new home. The Enschede Printing Museum was run by somebody called Johan de Zerter in Haarlem in Holland, and was in the basement of the Enschede Printing Works, who print European banknotes. One of the strange things about visiting this museum was that you had to be searched on entry and then weighed as you went through a special airport-style search mechanism, and weighed again when you left. So obviously they were checking you weren't carrying any banknotes. This museum has now gone to the city of Haarlem, and hopefully at some point the collection will be available. The Musée Goupil in Bordeaux is a museum I've wanted to visit for many, many years. It's the largest collection of Woodbury type and photogravure that's around. It used to be theoretically open on Wednesdays, but I've never managed to ever visit it. But there is some hope, because now apparently it's again been taken over by the city of Bordeaux and may be opening again properly soon. I've put in Bristol Industrial Museum collection because I think it's one of those that fairly typifies what's happened about the history of printing. There was a good printing collection in Bristol, but the museum has now become the M Shed and has restructured as a more interactive, hands-on experience. And nearly all of the printing history has gone to other places. So we at UE had some of the type back, and in fact some of the presses went to the Musée de Lyon, the Musée de Livre in Lyon in France. So been a bit dispersed. The John Jarrell collection was probably England's most famous collection of printing history, and that too is currently closed and is looking for a new home in Norwich. So hopefully that itself will open again at some point. The Type Museum in London has a long history and is mainly the Stevenson Blake collection. Currently it's only open occasionally, and some of the good news is that the Science Museum may take over this collection and might move it to Rawton, but I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. The Fratelli Alinari collection, which was a collection of 150,000 glass plate photographs. Fratelli Alinari also printed traditional collotype, and sadly the family have sold off the collection, but hopefully the city of Florence will also find it a home. Just before I get to my top 10, I need to talk to you about an original Heidelberg windmill press. Now, just about every printing museum has one of these, and there's a reason for that, which is the Heidelberg apprentices at the Heidelberg Printing Works get to restore one of these as part of their passing out of being an apprentice at the end of their apprenticeship. So most museums in Europe have had one of these at one point that's gone to Heidelberg and been reconditioned and come back to the museums. So you see an awful lot. So I thought I'd show you one, and then we don't have to look at them every time we talk about a museum. So my number 10, surprising to some people, may be the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz in Germany. Now, the Gutenberg Museum is one of Europe's oldest printing museums. It originally opened in 1900. It's in a beautiful building in Mainz. It was run by a great lady called Eva Hannebut-Benz, incredibly knowledgeable on wooden presses and early printing. And it has a fabulous library and a really nice collection of books and artifacts relating to printing. But I have one or two problems with it. First of all is that in the foyer is a replica of a wooden press, but it's generally accepted that this press doesn't actually look much like Gutenberg's original press would have looked like. And it wasn't made till the 18th century anyway, this press. So nobody's really quite sure what Gutenberg's press was like. The other problem is they have two Gutenberg Bibles, but they're behind such thick plate glass that it's almost impossible to see what's going on. I will stress, as I say, other parts of their collection are wonderful. They've got original copies of Jacob Christoph's Leblanc Colorito, and I got really excited to go and see that, and to see that the 3 colour plates, when you actually unfold the bits of Colorito, have up to 20 colours on each of the 3 plates. But we won't go into that, it's another lecture. But the Gutenberg Bibles, as I say, behind these big glass plates are so difficult to see, which is why I put this terrible photo in. And in fact, if you go to the New York Public Library, as you walk into the start of the reading rooms, there's a case that has a Gutenberg 42-line Bible that you can actually see, and they move the page every day. And in addition, by special permission, if you make an appointment, you can go to the John Rylands in Manchester, where they have 3 Gutenberg Bibles, and they will actually get one out and put it in front of you, and you can physically see it and turn the pages. So the Gutenberg's a great museum, but just slightly disappointing, in my view. My number 9, coming in at number 9, is the Helsingborg Printing Museum in Sweden. Now, it's in Fredriksdal Park and Gardens, and is said to be Scandinavia's largest printing museum. Now, I'm not quite so sure about that, as it's quite tiny and it's a very sweet museum in a beautiful setting. And I suspect the museum at Odense was bigger. But on the other hand, this is in a park with a little 3-story building. It's in a kind of replica village, or an old village of vernacular architecture. And spread over 3 floors. The people who run it are absolutely wonderful. But the park and the gardens nearby are just stunning. And this is just to show you one of the typesetting machines in the museum. Got a good collection of generic letterpress and printing history. This is the gardens, which I think is absolutely stunning. And then the other good thing about it is you can take the ferry from Helsingborg, where this is situated, to Elsinore. And it's a great boat trip. And you get to go past Elsinore Castle, and then you can get on the train to Stockholm. So, great little museum, and I really love it. In at my number 8 is not really a printing museum. It's the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam. But one of the things about the Rembrandt House is it's a beautiful 4-story building with a huge extension on the side. It lays out all of Rembrandt's life, and you can look at where he lived. It does actually have a proper little printing press, and they still print from plates, and I think replicas of Rembrandt plates. But the press, I'm reliably informed, is fairly authentic, and they tend to use pretty authentic materials to print some of the original plates. So it's one of the few places where you can go to a good museum and see printing happening as it would have happened. And the other thing is you can also see Rembrandt's studio. My next, coming in at number 7, is the MIAT, the Industrial Museum in Ghent in Belgium. It was originally called the Museum of Industry, Art, Work and Textiles, and is in a great museum, in a great situation in Ghent, beside the river. and it's a really interesting large factory, ex-factory, that on the ground lower floor has a big ex-printing works. What's really nice is there's a whole ex-printing work laid out across the whole expanse of the first floor. So you get an impression of what a printing works would have looked like and how everything's there. And then on the second floor is a great textile collection, which goes completely from carding and spinning right the way through to fabric production. They have a good collection of presses and just a really nice museum in a really nice city where the food is really good. So here shows you it's a kind of working space and what it would have been like to work in a print works in maybe the 1920s or 30s. It's also, my contact there is somebody called Robin Boone, who's part of European Printing Museums and is a great enthusiast about all things printing. And here's the textile element, where from carding right at the start and spinning right through. So the museum gives you that kind of industrial feel of the history of technology. Next one is an unusual one. It's the State Office for Digitisation, Broadband and Surveying in Munich, which doesn't sound much like a printing museum. But in the basement of this building is the Saxony Connection of maps, which were made by Sennefelder. Now, what happened was Napoleon invaded Lower Saxony, and in order to collect taxes, he wanted the whole area mapped. And Sennefelder had recently invented lithography. So Napoleon commissioned Sennefelder to create maps of the whole area of Lower Saxony on, in fact, 26,000 litho stones, which is absolutely wonderful. This is nearby where they come from. And these stones were still used, still drawn on and corrected right up to 1966. And unlike the Ordnance Survey in the UK, who tipped all their stones into the Solent, Lower Saxony kept theirs, and the collection is still available and you can still go and see it. But you have to go by special appointment. I've been a couple of times during what are called the lithography days, run by a lady called Geza Perl, once every 5 years in Munich, and I visited this place twice. At the same time nearby are the quarries where one family still quarries lithographic stones. The majority of the limestone that comes from the quarry goes to make paving slabs and garden rockery, and all the rubble ends up in building material. But one family by hand still lift the layers of limestone with basically an adze and a pick and shovel, and then trim them by hand, which is quite amazing. So coming in at number 5 is the Dublin National Museum of Print. And I like this museum because it's very small, it's lovely, and it lays out the whole history of print in a very small space. It's very clear about how that print history develops. But what's also really nice about it is it's got a ruling machine. Now, those of us of a certain age who were brought up in the 50s and 60s and 70s will have had ruled school exercise books. And these were all printed on a ruling machine like this, where basically a series of strings of which ink or paint is painted along the strings. It picks up the colour. And then as the paper passes through, depending on the widths you've set the strings will print a green or a red or a blue line. There's a kind of real nostalgia. We were offered one of these machines many years ago, and I would have loved to have had it, but it's far too big and they're very difficult to set up, and they're kind of useless but wonderful. The other thing is this museum has a really good collection of trades union banners and posters, all related to Irish history. And it's really nice to see this relationship between the collections of banners and the printing history, and again, that kind of union support of what was going on. And finally, one thing that's very good is it has a superb cafe run by an American chef and does really good food. And one of the good things about printing museums, and most of them in some way have food nearby. So my next one is the Museum of Work in Hamburg. The main curator there, Jürgen Bernig, who was for a while director, is a great enthusiast of how the social aspect of work relates to the industrial museum. So this museum is a huge building, and it has a complete printing factory in it. It has a complete plastic cone factory. It has a complete enamel factory, and just vast quantities of machinery throughout, but laid out in a very elegant and spacious manner. This is a copy of the original Königsberg rotary press that was the first press. The Times had one of these built in 1870 for printing early copies of the Times on one of the first rotary presses, which I think is earlier than 1870. But this is a Königsberg press. This gives you an idea of the spaciousness of the museum and the nice collection of things that they have that you can peruse quietly, and just got plenty of space and elegance in this building. One of the things that's really interesting is they have a pantograph for cutting wooden letters. Now, the only other one I know of in a museum is in the Hamilton Type Museum in Wisconsin. But Museum de Arbeit have this letter cutting pantograph, and you can go by arrangement and cut letters there, which is kind of interesting because it's rare to be able to do that, and you can go and cut lots with lettering. They also have the largest lithographic stone I've ever seen, which is 3 meters by 2 meters, which is stored just outside the museum in an ancillary shed. And they're very active as a museum about printing from their presses and producing books and volumes. And I think you'll find that Sarah Bodman from CFPR has collaborated with them over artist book fairs and similar things. Their enamel badge collection is spectacular, and their little enamel badge museum is splendid. And they're very conscious of running exhibitions that relate to the history of enamel badges. And I've collaborated with them over an enamel badge exhibition before. My number 3 is a fabulous museum, the Barla Papier Museum. It's almost my favourite, but then there are other museums which are more spectacular. But the interesting thing about the Barla Papier Museum is it starts on the ground floor with the water mill and the paper making facilities. On the first floor is type composition and typesetting. On the second floor is printing, and on the third floor is binding and finishing. So you can run the whole thing from top to bottom. The ground floor paper making is spectacular. It's got a huge stone Hollander beater you can see on the left here. And the hammers you can see in the background are for calendaring paper, basically for putting a smooth surface on the paper. And they clonk up and down really slowly. And one of the things that scared the living daylights out of me when I went to visit them were school children were calendaring their paper by hand, holding a sheet underneath the hammer as it went up and down and clonked onto their paper. Health and safety nightmare, but they seem to get through it, and it seems to work very well. This is on the second floor, the printing. This is a little all-style type printing press. As you can see, standard printing press, but they do print a lot here. I used to know the director, a man called Martin Smuller, who was very keen on the whole museum actually creating works and still printing and still working on a regular basis. This is typesetting on the floor, same floor. And one of the things about them also is that they have lovely bindery on the top floor. They also have a whole section which is about calligraphy, and it has good food attached nearby. You can get really good food just beside the museum. My number 2 is the Museum for Printing in Leipzig. Now, this building has a long history. It's a huge old printing works in Leipzig that used to be a collection of somebody called Herr Schumacher Gabler, who was part of the government before East Germany joined to West Germany. Mr. Schumacher-Gabler had collected hundreds of presses. He had a vast collection of nearly 500,000 cases of type, and every sort of printing process, including collotype and lithography, letterpress, typesetting, you name it, this museum had it. In recent years, it's been taken over by Leipzig Town Council and has a new curator. Was also the last place to print collotype on a regular basis in East Germany. It is this old, huge printing factory, and it's just vast numbers of machinery. One of the interesting things is that it has cast iron type as well as lead type, which is just unbelievably huge, great hefty metal letters. And every type of press imaginable. It is a complete history of printing in vast scale. And they still regularly print. They've fairly recently, I think, printed the Shakespeare folio copies for the Folio Society, and still a regular take on commercial letterpress jobs. Here's one of about 30 typesetting machines they have. And here's collotype. This is somebody called Achim Müller, who's actually printing a first early digital collotype by Paul Zerkel. We had a long collaboration with the Lichtdruck Werkstatt in the Leipzig Printing Museum and worked with them over quite a few years over collotype. And finally, my number one is the Plantan-Moretus Museum in Antwerp. Now, this is if you're going to see any museum, go and see this one. It's a World Heritage Site. It's been around, it became a museum in 1830, I think, but it's been around since the 1600s, and it was originally the Plantan-Moretus family actually printed Bibles for South America. And it has this beautiful courtyard. It's in Antwerp, and it's not far from Rembrandt House. So there's also quite a few Rubens portraits here, and you can visit the Rembrandt House as well, which is 5 minutes walk. This museum is less than 10 minutes walk from the train station in Antwerp, and you go through the high street, and then just off the end of the high street, you come to this museum with lots of bars outside with great Belgian beer. But it has the 3 oldest still working wooden presses in Europe. They are still used. My contact is a man called Guy Houtspout, who's in charge of the physical side of printing at the Plantan-Moretus. And Guy is incredibly knowledgeable about wooden presses. And you can see there are 4 presses down the left-hand side, but 3 of them are really old and the 4th isn't quite as old. But this museum also has a fabulous library of all the Bibles they've printed from the 1700s onwards, and a whole fabulous collections of rooms, all related to print. It is just stunning. And then finally, for museums and collections I could or should have included, the Playing Card and Print Museum in Grevenmacher in Luxembourg is a lovely little museum in Luxembourg, right by the Rhine. It has a small playing card collection and printing collection, and it's just a really nice museum to visit. But if you really want to see a playing card collection and a good print museum, the museum in Turnhout in Belgium is well worth going to. It's also near the Frans Masriel Centrum, so if you're an artist, you can visit both nearby in one go. Sadly, one of the main print workers at the print museum in Turnhout has recently died, but the museum's still open and still going. As I say, the Enschede Printing Museum and the Danish Media Museum I would have liked to have included, and were spoken about at the start, but both sadly closed, along with the Fratelli Hellinari. It was wonderful to go and watch some printing collotype there, and just to see the crazy way that they held all the collection together and moved glass printing plates up and down 4 stories on tiny narrow staircases was quite amazing. The Printing Museum in Darmstadt, printed litho, it has to be mentioned. It's a huge printing museum and well worth a visit. The Dornbirn Printing Museum in Austria was run by somebody called Eckhard Gorbach. I don't know what's happened recently. Eckhard got very ill, but it was a tiny little museum which is really well worth a visit and beautifully laid out. And Dornbirn's quite a nice little town. If you're interested in newspapers, the German Newspaper Museum in Saarbrücken in Germany is well worth going to. It has, the front of house is how newspapers are printed, and the back is a kind of collection which is all about newspapers. The Musée du Livre in Lyon was run by a man called Alan Marshall, who's since retired. Again, a beautiful printing museum. Alan's particular interest was photo typesetting from the 50s onwards, and the Musée du Livre, as well as having good collections of type and letterpress, was also very good on photo typesetting. The Deutsche Techniker Museum in Berlin has a collection, is worth going to. It's also worth going to because it's got DC-3 hanging from the ceiling, which is great. Likewise, the Musée d'Art et Métier in Paris has a collection. I got really enthused. I went once and pulled the drawer open, and there was a really nice little enamel of Poitevin, who invented collotype, just lying in a drawer. So well worth visiting. The Museum Bodini in Parma, the Bodini Museum, has recently had a new director and is much, much more active than was in the past, and well worth visiting. The Book Museum in Lodz is run by three guys who are really into printing, both old and new technology, and are really, really keen on book arts. And Sarah Bodman will tell you lots about the Book Art Museum in Lodz. Typorama in Bischofsfeld in Switzerland they are totally concerned with linotype machines. In fact, so much so that when I was walking around the Imprimerie Nationale next to one of the two brothers from Typorama in Bischofsfeld, we could hear a linotype machine clattering away in the background, but couldn't see it. And the brother turned to me and said, "That's a 1953 Mark II, and the bar that goes across the top is slightly bent." They just know from the sound of things just how and why there are problems with linotype machines. So they're definitely the world experts on linotype. The St. Bride's Printing Library was a beautiful collection. It's run into all sorts of problems over recent years, but you can still go to the library. There's a little collection of about 6 or 8 presses, and it's a very good library on the history of printing just off Fleet Street, and a great place to go. And the Science Museum printing collection is moving out to Raunton from near Swindon, from London, where it's been stored in West London. So it should improve over the next few years. We've been having discussions with the Science Museum as to what their collection might look like and what's in it. They are, in fact, one of the few people I know that actually have a couple of automatic screen printing beds from the 30s. And I know of no other museum in Europe that actually specialises in screen printing at all. So thank you very much.